Hey, I'm Pepe, and welcome to Tau Coding. In this video series, we're going to talk about Flask, Dash, and other libraries that will help us with the web development in Python. Let's get started. In this part of the Flask video series, we are going to talk a bit more about how to do login in a web application. For that, we are going to use the flask-login library, right? The flask-login library is a small wrapper over the Flask mechanisms that it provides for doing logging, sessions, etc. And yeah, it will work together with the other libraries that we are using already. So the first thing that we are going to need is to add this library to our project, right? For that, we are going to use pipenv. So pipenv install flask-login. The documentation for flask-login is awesome. We are going to only touch a little bit of the whole library, but I advise that you go ahead and read it. In flask-login, read the docs.io. So our library is installed already. We can see that in the pip file that it added a new entry. And we can start by adding the needed content. Oh, by the way, off camera, I added some more interesting layout to our application because it was a bit poor. So now if we run our application, there you go. So if we run it, we have another layout, some menu, and yeah, some basic layout for our application to work. By the way, all this is copied basically from the Bootstrap webpage, so go ahead and check it. So what we want to do, let me close the template here and let's open the application. There you go. So we'll have to do several things in order to make flask-login work. First of all, we'll need to add a new column to our user. The column that we want to add is an ID column, typical ID with an auto-increment integer. The reason for that is that flask-login will require something, some field in the user to be the ID. And it's easier for us to make it the ID. So we can create it with ID equals db.column, and the type for it will be db.integer, and we want to create this one as a primary key. Normally, well, of course, we can only have one primary key, so let's remove the other one. Normally, we wouldn't want to make this change directly, changing a primary key from one field to another in a table. I mean, in a table that has some data already. What we will do in the end is recreate the table. So delete it, drop it, and create it again. Before doing that, we want to make these two nullable. So nullable, non-nullable, I mean. So nullable, false, and same thing for the password. The reason for that is that, yeah, we don't want emails and password to be null. Let me see. So what we can do now in order to generate the new migration file is to call flask migrate, flask-db migrate, and then pass a message to it saying something like add ID column. That's cool. This should have created, there you go, a new file in the versions folder. And what we'll do is we'll remove that and we'll create our own, right? So we will start by copying all this from the previous migration and we'll put it here. Before that, of course, we want to first op drop table user, and then we'll create it again. So we want it to have so we want an ID of the type integer. There you go, new level false, auto increment true. There you go. Do we want the email to be new level false? We want the password to be new level false as well, which previously was new level true, and we want the primary key to be the ID. Cool. And in order to go to the previous state, what we want to do is, yeah, more or less the opposite, right? So we want to, so the previous state, not this one, sorry, but the other migration here. This is the first migration. So this is the first state of our users table. So we want to come back to it when downgrading from this version to the previous one. So op.drop table user. So what will happen is that when we upgrade to this new version, we will first drop the table user. That right now is not a problem because we don't have any data inside. And we will recreate the user table with all the correct fields. And when downgrading from this version to the previous one, we'll drop the table user. So this definition of the table user, and we'll create the previous one. So that's more or less the idea. Let me see if we can run this. So flask-db upgrade. Okay, seems to have run, and this should have modified the SQLite.db file. Let's check it out with git status. Cool, yeah, it has modified it. That's great. We already have some, we have the data as we want in the database. So let's come back here to the application. And we'll need to, what's that, import? We don't really need it. Let's remove it. We need to start by importing flask-login. So from flask-login, we want to import the login manager. So once we have imported the login manager, we can create the instance and initialize it with the app. We'll say that login will be e-login. Let me see if I can spell correctly. Equals to login manager. Manager, there you go. And we want to initialize it to the app. Oh no, but we do that with login.init app and the app. Let's see if our application runs now. Flask run. And it should run without problem. Oh, and it says that we are missing the user loader, right? The user loader is some other feature from, well, some requirement from the flask-login library. And the user loader is a function annotated with a decorator from flask-login, right? We'll say that at login.userLoader, right? And this function is the one that will be in charge of retrieving users given their ID for login purposes, right? So we'll not call this this function manually, but Flask login will do. So we do receive a user ID, and it will we need to return an instance of our user class, right? So in our case, we need to return user.query.filter by, and we want the user ID to be equals to user ID, and then we want to return the first. We want to return the first, and otherwise it will return none, which is what we want. Something else that we'll need is to make our, we need to add some specific method to our user class, right? These are detailed in the flask-login documentation, right? So we need to add all these to our user class. So we can either implement them manually, which is possible and not very hard, but we can also make our application extend user mixin, as this is explained in the documentation, right? So luckily, Python has multiple inheritance, which in this case is useful. So we can also make a user a part of inheriting from DB model. We can make it have the user mixing methods. And we can do that by making this user mixing, and this should have auto imported what we wanted. There you go. So if we try to run our application now, it should run smoothly without errors. So let's try that out. So it's localhost. And this says that our class user has no property user ID. Of course, it doesn't have it, and that's because it's called ID only. So now, yeah, there we have it. So our app loads without problems. Let's make it possible to register and to log in users, which is what this video was about. So in order to register a user, we can do that here. Recall from the previous session that when receiving the register form, we were just validating the form, and if it was valid, we were returning it's valid. This is not what we actually want to do, right? So first we want to check that both the password and the repeat password are the same, right? We check that with form.password.data is equal to form.repeatpassword.data. That's cool. And if these are the same, we want to create our user class, our user instance, sorry. So user will be equal to user, right? And the email will be form.email.data. And what we would do, right, in order to save the password would be something like this. Password equals form.password.data. However, if we did it that way, we would be saving the password in plain text, and we don't really want to do that. What we want to do instead is to hash the password so that the plain text of your password is never saved into a database. And if this database leaks or someone stole the database, they don't get your password. So we need to hash our password. In order to hash our password, the simplest way is using one of the underlying libraries for Flask is called Verkzeug. So we can import some functions from it for hashing and checking hashed passwords. We can do that with from verkzeug.security. We want to import generate password hash and check password hash. Awesome. So now instead of saving the password this way, we want to save only the hashed password. So generate password hash. That's cool. So now we have created the instance of our user class, but we are not saving it yet, right? So in order to save it, we can do db.session.add, and we add our instance user, and db.session.commit. So this will save it as if and it will send the actual SQL queries for saving it. Cool. So we are already saving a user. The only thing that's lacking now is to redirect the user to somewhere meaningful, right? Instead of just returning an empty response. We can do that with return. And let's say that we want to redirect the user to the index, for example. So let's import redirect. Let's import URL4. That's imported there. That's cool. So we want to redirect the user to the index. That's great. Now if we try to... Oh, we have an error here. Trailing command not allowed. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Trailing command not allowed. Okay, that looks better. Let's try to save some user. So So this way, if we register, okay, it redirects us to the homepage. That means that it worked. Cool. So now let's work on the login part. The login part, we are handling it in this other endpoint here. And we were doing the same thing, right? We were just returning it's valid when the form validated correctly. So what we want to do is to first query the database, query the table users by email. And when we receive the email, we want to check the password afterwards. So let's do that. Let's say that our user will be user.query.filter by. We want to say email equals form dot email dot data, and we want the first record only. That's great. And now what we want to do is if check password hash user dot password. Let me see what's the order that this requires. Okay, so first the hash and then the password. So in this case, the hash is what is stored in the database. So user dot password, and then the actual password. This is what we receive in the form. So form dot password dot data. If this is true, it means that the check was successful. So we can make the user login. In order to do that, we can simply call login user, right? That we'll need to import from flask-login. Okay, so we want to log in the user, and we want to redirect the user to the index as well. And ooh, what was that? Oh, that's okay. We need to return the response. That's cool. That's cool. So if we reload the page, nothing happens yet. We log in. Let's try that with the user that we just created, pepe@pepegar.com, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, something happened. We cannot yet see if the user is logged, but we should be able to see if Flask set some cookies for that. So let's repeat that. And let's see if in the response for that, there is some cookie. Okay, so apparently there is some cookie already. The session cookie right here, right? This session cookie is what Flask sets in order to identify that the user is already logged in. So that's cool. Something else that we can do is that we can in some way identify the user, right? And say that instead of hello world, we want to say hello and then the user email, for example. We can do that as well. Let's see in the templates, in the index, for example. So let's make a conditional and say that if the current user is authenticated, we want to render their name. Otherwise, we will render the hello world. So h1, hello, and their email will be in current user.email. Cool. So if we reload now, should we see the email? There you go. So we can see now how user is logged in. Should we make also a way of logging out? Yes, I think so. So let's add that as well. Let's add a new endpoint here, uproot /logout. And when going to /logout, it does not receive any parameter. What we'll do is just call logout user. Oh, we don't need to pass anything here. And let's redirect the user to the index now. So return, redirect, URL for index. That's cool. So now we are logged in. We can see that because here we have the email of the user. If we go to /logout, we should end up in this same in the home page as well, but without with the message saying hello world. There you go. Cool. So that was it for this video. We have learned how to use flask-login, how to interact also with Flask SQL Alchemy models, how to check the models in the database, and how to save passwords in a safe way, right? Instead of saving the passwords in plain text, we are saving them only the hashed text instead. So that was it for this video, and yeah, stay tuned for the next ones. Take care.